Welcome to the channel where history meets mind-blowing facts. Here your knowledge will get a powerful boost with every video. From hidden events to legendary figures, we cover it all. The story of the Anglo-Saxon Huscarls begins not in England, but across the sea. In the fierce and cold lands of Scandinavia, these warriors were not born from ordinary men. They were forged in blood, battle, and unwavering loyalty. Originally, inspired by the Viking tradition of personal bodyguards known as herdmen, the Huscarls became something far greater. When King Canute the Great, a Danish conqueror, seized the throne of England in the early 11th century, he brought with him a vision to reshape the very core of power and protection in his new kingdom. He knew he couldn't rely on the fragile loyalty of distant nobles or the undisciplined ranks of peasant levies. He needed something stronger, something terrifying, something elite. Canute created the Huscarls as his personal guard, hand-picked warriors who answered to no one but the king himself. They weren't just muscle with swords. These men lived and breathed loyalty. To betray their king meant death, and to fail him in battle was worse than death. It was disgrace. And disgrace was unbearable for a man who wore the badge of a Huscarl. From the moment they entered service, their life was bound to the crown. They ate, trained, slept, and marched with one purpose: to protect the king and uphold his rule at all costs. Their lives became a symbol of discipline, power, and unwavering control, something the chaotic English realm desperately needed. Unlike common soldiers, Huscarls were paid in silver and treated with a respect even nobles struggled to earn. Many came from noble or warrior bloodlines themselves, especially among the Danish and Norse ranks, and others rose through sheer strength, courage, and relentless dedication. But this wasn't a job for the faint of heart. It was a calling, and not everyone could answer it. Those who did were expected to master the deadly two-handed Dane axe, a weapon so brutal it could shatter shields, cleave through mail, and split helmets in a single thunderous blow. The very sight of Huscarls wielding these massive axes on the battlefield was enough to send chills through the enemy ranks. They stood like a wall of iron, unmoving and unbroken, anchoring the lines while lesser men faltered. But the Huscarls weren't just war machines. They were symbols of order. In a time where politics were soaked in betrayal and rival lords fought for influence, the Huscarls brought something rare to the kingdom: trust. They were a statement. When a king stood flanked by these towering warriors, it sent a clear message: this is not a ruler you can defy without consequence. And the kings knew it too. From Knut to Edward the Confessor, and finally to Harold Godwinson, each ruler leaned on their Huscarls not just for protection, but for legitimacy. They were the steel backbone of the crown. What made the Huscarls even more unique was how they blended cultures. Though born from Viking roots, they adapted quickly to Anglo-Saxon life. They spoke the language, lived among the people, and became part of the kingdom's identity. And yet, their Norse blood never faded. Their customs, their code of honor, their fearless spirit, it all remained, giving them a mystique that both inspired and intimidated. In the royal halls they stood silent and still, ever watchful, clad in chainmail and armed with their deadly axes. But when war called, they transformed into a whirlwind of fury and precision, moving as one, killing as one. They were more than bodyguards. They were enforcers, champions, and the final word in any conflict that dared reach the king. If there was rebellion, Huscarls crushed it. If there was assassination, Huscarls prevented it. They were everywhere and nowhere, loyal shadows that walked beside power itself. To see a Huscarl was to feel the presence of the throne, and to cross one was to challenge the will of the king. Their numbers weren't vast, but that only added to their value. Each man was worth 10 ordinary soldiers, not just in strength, but in experience, skill, and resolve. As the years passed and new kings rose, the Huscarls remained, adapting but never losing the core of what they were. They became a permanent fixture of the royal household, a symbol as iconic as the crown itself. From London to the battlefields of the north, their reputation followed them like a shadow. People spoke of them in hushed tones, with respect and fear, knowing that if you saw a Huscarl, you were in the presence of something ancient, something sacred, something forged in the oldest fires of honor and war. The true strength of the Anglo-Saxon Huscarls didn't just lie in their legendary loyalty. It was carved into their bones through a brutal and disciplined lifestyle that turned them into some of the most feared warriors of their time. Becoming a Huscarl simply handed through relentless training, unwavering discipline, and a personal commitment to something bigger than yourself. From the moment a man was selected to join this elite brotherhood, his old life vanished. Every day was a test of strength, of patience, of pain, and of loyalty. These were not peasants thrust into war with farming tools and raw hope. Huscarls, trained like wolves, methodically, strategically, and without mercy. Each morning began with weapon drills that pushed the body to its limits. They trained with swords, shields, spears, but above all, they mastered the Dane axe. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a monstrous two-handed instrument of war, nearly as tall as the men who wielded it. Swinging it required not just power but perfect control. In the hands of a novice, it was clumsy and slow, but in the hands of a trained Huscarl, it was swift, brutal, and precise. They learned how to split shields in two, how to cleave a man from shoulder to hip, how to use the weapon's weight to their advantage and turn the momentum of every swing into a deadly rhythm. Training with the Dane axe wasn't just about fighting. It was about becoming one with the weapon, letting it guide your instincts until it moved like an extension of your own body. But combat training was only one part of the equation. Discipline was drilled into them like armor. A Huscarl didn't break rank. A Huscarl didn't flee. In battle, they formed the unshakable core of the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, locking shoulders and shields to create a human fortress. Their job wasn't to chase glory, it was to hold the line, and hold it they did. While others might falter under pressure, Huscarls stood firm, taking the brunt of enemy charges, arrows, and chaos, and giving back only death in return. The shield wall was only as strong as the men who stood in it, and the Huscarls were the iron nails that held it together. Their loyalty wasn't just to the king, it was to each other. The bond between Huscarls was forged in the fires of shared suffering and battlefield trust. They lived together, trained together, and often died together. If one fell in battle, another would take his place without hesitation. Cowardice wasn't an option. They fought not just for the crown, but for the brother beside them. That kind of unity couldn't be faked. It had to be earned over time, through blood, sweat, and absolute commitment to the code they lived by. Their presence in the royal hall was as intimidating as it was symbolic. Clad in chainmail, carrying axes and swords, Huscarls stood silently behind their king like statues of death. They didn't speak unless spoken to. Their very stillness was a warning. Any noble, emissary, or rival who dared raise their voice or question the king's authority would immediately feel the cold eyes of a Huscarl settle on them, and in that silent stare, they would remember what these men were capable of. One wrong move could end in a flash of steel and a lifetime of regret. When war erupted, Huscarls were the first to march and the last to retreat. They didn't just fight, they executed tactics with precision. They knew how to flank, how to draw enemies in, how to reinforce collapsing lines. Their training allowed them to adapt to the chaos of war with calm calculation. They didn't panic, even when surrounded. They stood and fought until the enemy was broken or until they were. Their enemies feared them, not just for their skill but for their complete absence of fear. To face a Huscarl in battle was to face a man who had already accepted death as a companion. And that kind of warrior doesn't hesitate, doesn't hold back, and never flinches. In the grand halls of Anglo-Saxon kings, beneath the banners of royal power, and between whispers of courtly intrigue, there stood an unshakable force that needed no introduction: the Huscarls. Their very presence in the court was like the sound of thunder before a storm, silent but impossible to ignore. These weren't simply guards positioned to intimidate foreign guests or overconfident nobles. The Huscarls were guardians of the throne itself, a living wall between the king and the chaos that constantly threatened to creep in from every corner of the kingdom. While nobles played games of influence and clergy whispered into royal ears, the Huscarls said nothing, but their axes spoke volumes. They didn't have to play politics, their loyalty was their voice. Their power was in their silence. Every king who ruled during the era of the Huscarls knew one undeniable truth: his throne was only as secure as the men who defended it. These warriors weren't chosen because of noble birth or political convenience. They were chosen because of their unmatched skill, their discipline, and most importantly, their unbreakable loyalty. They swore allegiance not to land, not to gold, but to the crown. And in a time where betrayal lurked in every shadow, that kind of loyalty was rarer than gold and more valuable than an army. The Huscarls served not only as bodyguards, but as enforcers of royal authority. When the king entered a hall or a battlefield, his Huscarls were the living message he brought with him. Their mailcoats gleamed under torchlight, their axes rested against broad shoulders, and their eyes scanned every room with quiet intensity. One glance from a Huscarl could turn a defiant noble into a silent one. One movement of their hand toward the axe could stop an argument mid-sentence. They were the physical embodiment of royal justice and royal wrath. And that power made them far more than soldiers. It made them symbols. In times of war, the Huscarls didn't just follow their king. They became the point of his spear. When King Harold Godwinson took the throne, it was the Huscarls who formed the heart of his military force. Their discipline allowed the Anglo-Saxon armies to function with cohesion in the chaos of battle, and when Harold needed to assert his authority over rivals, rebel earls, or foreign threats, it was the Huscarls who stood closest to him, ready to enforce the crown's will without hesitation. They were more than warriors. They were the kings, judgment given steel and muscle. But their duties extended beyond the battlefield and the courtroom. Huscarls were trusted with the most personal moments of royal life. They guarded the king's chambers at night, watched over him during feasts, rode beside him during royal processions. They weren't just protectors from outside threats. They were shields against the dangers within the court. Assassins, poisoners, plotters, none could easily slip past the ever-watchful eyes of the Huscarls. Their loyalty wasn't questioned because their lives were built around the idea of service. To betray their king would be to destroy the very foundation of their identity. Their loyalty was tested time and again they proved themselves. Even as power shifted hands and the kingdom teetered on the edge of uncertainty, the Huscarls remained constant. Through the reign of King Cunod, they had proven their value as a foreign king's iron grip on a divided land. Under Edward the Confessor, they continued to serve with the same loyalty, even as rival factions jostled for influence. And when Harold Godwinson seized the throne, the Huscarls stood by him without hesitation. Their oath wasn't to politics. It was to the throne. And no matter who sat on it, as long as that man was king, the Huscarls would protect him with their lives. It wasn't uncommon for a king to elevate a Huscarl to positions of great trust, beyond even the battlefield. Some became commanders, trusted advisors, or stewards of royal estates. Their value wasn't limited to their axe arm. They were men of discipline, honor, and experience, and kings recognized that. And unlike many nobles, a Huscarl's loyalty didn't come with strings attached. There were no games, no family alliances to manage, no rivalries to navigate. Just loyalty. Just duty. And that made them priceless. Their closeness to the throne made them more than warriors in the eyes of the people. In villages and towns, stories spread of the Huscarls' bravery, of how they held the line against Viking invaders, of how they cut down rebel The morning of October 14, 1066 was cold and tense. On Senlac Hill near Hastings, the Huscarls stood shoulder to shoulder with King Harold Godwinson, the last true Anglo-Saxon king of England. Their chainmail glinted under the pale sun, and their massive Dane axes rested ready in their grip. Behind them stood the Fyrd, untrained men pulled from farms and villages. But in front, in the very heart of the shield wall, stood the Huscarls, silent, calm, prepared. They knew what was coming. Across the field, the Normans gathered under Duke William's banner, a force of cavalry, archers, and ambition. The fate of a kingdom would be decided that day, and the Huscarls knew this might be their final stand. But not one of them flinched. Not one of them asked for mercy. They had sworn their lives to the crown, and this was where that oath would be tested, like never before. When the Norman cavalry charged, they expected to break the English line quickly, but they hit a wall of steel and fury. The Huscarls didn't budge. Their axes tore through horse and rider alike. These were not men easily shaken. They had fought in endless battles before, and they understood that victory was not won by chaos, but by discipline. The Normans charged again and again, but each time they were repelled. The shield wall held. Arrows rained down, horses fell screaming, but the Huscarls stood tall, bloodied but unbroken. They were the iron heart of Harold's army, and as long as they stood, the line would not fail. But the Normans were relentless. They changed tactics, faked retreats to lure the less experienced Fyrd away from the formation, and slowly, cracks began to form. As the line thinned, the Huscarls had to cover more ground, fight harder, and defend against enemies on more sides. Their arms ached, their faces bloodied, but they did not retreat. Some fought on with shattered shields, others with broken helmets, swinging their axes in great arcs that left the ground soaked in blood. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew they were surrounded. But surrender was never an option. This was their duty. This was their destiny. King Harold fought among them, not from behind, but in the thick of the chaos. The Huscarls rallied to him, forming a protective ring around their king, holding back wave after wave of Norman attackers. They fought like men possessed, screaming their battle cries, their axes singing through the air. And yet, the tide was turning. The Normans, regrouped and more cautious, began to break through the weaker parts of the line. The Huscarls fought harder, some even stepping over the bodies of their brothers to shield the king. One by one, they fell. Not in retreat, not in fear, but in defiance. Then came the arrow. The moment that would be etched into history forever. King Harold was struck, some say through the eye, others through the chest, but whatever the truth, the result was the same. The king was dead. Word spread like wildfire, and the English line wavered. But the Huscarls did not run. They did not drop their weapons. Instead, they closed ranks around their fallen king, refusing to give up his body to the enemy. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a sacred last stand. The last loyal warriors of a dying kingdom, fighting not for victory, but for honor. They fought until they were overwhelmed. Surrounded on all sides, blood pouring from wounds, they fell one after another. Some Huscarls were said to have taken down a dozen Normans before being cut down. Even when the rest of the English army fled, the Huscarls stayed, guarding their king in death as they had in life. And when the final axe dropped and the final warrior fell, an entire era collapsed with them. The Huscarls did not survive the conquest. Their way of life, their code, their brotherhood, it died on that hill, buried beneath the boots of a new Norman order. And though William would become king, though castles would rise and French tongues would dominate court, something ancient and powerful was lost forever. The Huscarls were gone but not forgotten. Their legend survived in whispered tales, in the silence of old weapons displayed in halls, in the echoes of a loyalty that modern kings could only dream of commanding. They were more than soldiers. They were the last guardians of a kingdom that no longer exists. The final flame of Anglo-Saxon England, extinguished on a battlefield soaked in blood and iron. Their story isn't just about death. It's about what it means to stand for something greater than yourself, to live and die for loyalty, honor, and legacy. If this story moved you, if the courage of these warriors left even a flicker of awe in your heart, don't let their legacy fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover more lost stories from history. Tales of bravery, sacrifice, and forgotten greatness that deserve to be remembered.